"The CEO can't handle a woman like me." He heard, smiled, and said, "Watch me try." Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. In a building full of ambitious people, Ruth Gemmell was the only one who had never wondered what it would be like to break through Henry Granville's legendary composure. Ruth Gemmell adjusted her wireless headset and pulled up another spreadsheet on her monitor, her coffee-brown fingers flying across the keyboard with practiced efficiency. At 27, she was one of the most respected project analysts at Thornfield Consulting, known for her sharp wit, infectious laugh, and the kind of brutal honesty that made people either love her or avoid her entirely. Her natural curls were pulled back into a professional low bun, and she wore a tailored burgundy blazer over black slacks, an outfit that managed to look both polished and approachable. Ruth had always believed that clothes should make you feel confident, not constrained, and today was no exception. "Ruth, have you seen the quarterly projections for the Hartwell account?" called out Amelia from the neighboring cubicle. Amelia was a sharp-tongued analyst from Atlanta, with impeccable style and an even sharper eye for detail. "Already sent them to your email," Ruth replied, without looking up from her screen, "along with some suggestions for streamlining their operational costs. They're bleeding money in their logistics department." "This is why you're everyone's favorite," said Trevor, spinning around in his desk chair with his characteristic finger guns pointed in Ruth's direction. Trevor was the kind of colleague who made even the most stressful deadlines bearable, all enthusiasm and terrible jokes, but brilliant when it came to data analysis. The 31st floor of Thornfield Consulting buzzed with its usual Monday energy. Ruth loved this environment, the collaborative atmosphere, the challenge of complex projects, and the satisfaction of solving problems that other firms couldn't crack. What she didn't love were the constant whispered conversations about their mysteriously aloof CEO. "Speaking of favorites," Amelia said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "have any of you ever actually had a real conversation with Mr. Granville?" "Define real conversation," Trevor replied, "because if you mean more than good morning and excellent work on the Jenkins proposal, then no." Ruth glanced up from her computer, mildly curious despite herself. In her 2 years at Thornfield, she'd seen Henry Granville exactly 12 times, always from a distance, always impeccably dressed, always looking like he was solving the world's problems in his head, while everyone else struggled with basic addition. "I heard he speaks 4 languages, offered Bethany, a junior analyst who always seemed to know the latest office gossip. "I heard he's never taken a vacation," added Trevor. "Not one, in the 7 years he's been CEO. "I heard," Amelia said with dramatic flair, "that he once made a grown man cry just by looking at his quarterly report." Ruth snorted with laughter. "You all are ridiculous. He's just a person, not some mythical creature." "Says the woman who's never been within 10 feet of him," Amelia shot back with a grin. "Because I have actual work to do," Ruth replied, but she was smiling. "Unlike some people who spend their time creating elaborate theories about our boss's personal life." As if summoned by their conversation, a hush fell over the floor. Ruth looked up to see Henry Granville stepping out of the executive elevator, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who were clearly trying to keep up with his measured but purposeful stride. Even from her cubicle, Ruth had to admit the man was impressive. At 35, Henry stood 6'2", with the kind of presence that made people instinctively straighten their postures. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit was clearly custom-tailored, and his steel blue eyes seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. The employees he passed offered polite nods and nervous smiles, which he acknowledged with the kind of economical grace that suggested he was used to being the center of attention, but didn't particularly enjoy it. "See what I mean?" Amelia whispered. "The man's like a beautiful iceberg, stunning to look at, but you just know there's something cold and unreachable underneath." Ruth watched as Henry paused at the reception desk to speak with Jennifer, their conversation too distant to hear but clearly professional. There was something about his posture, perfectly controlled, almost rigid, that made Ruth wonder if he ever relaxed, ever laughed, ever did anything spontaneous or impulsive. "He's probably never been surprised by anything in his entire life," she murmured, more to herself than to her colleagues. "What was that?" Trevor asked. "Nothing," Ruth said, turning back to her computer, just thinking out loud. But as she watched Henry disappear back into the executive elevator, Ruth found herself genuinely curious about the man behind the reputation. Not romantically curious, she had no interest in pursuing someone so clearly out of reach, but intellectually curious. What made someone so controlled, What would it take to crack that legendary composure? "Hey Ruth," Bethany called out, "are you going to the holiday party Friday night?" Ruth looked up, grateful for the distraction. "Wouldn't miss it? Why?" "Just wondering if you think Mr. Ice King will actually show up this year. Last year he made an appearance for exactly 23 minutes. "Someone timed him?" Ruth asked, incredulous. "Trevor did," Amelia admitted with a laugh. "It was for research purposes," Trevor protested. "I had a theory about maximum social exposure tolerance for introverted CEOs. Ruth shook her head, grinning. "You people need hobbies." "This is our hobby," Amelia said cheerfully, "trying to figure out if our CEO is actually human or some kind of sophisticated business android." As the day wore on, Ruth found herself occasionally glancing toward the executive floor whenever she walked past the windows that offered a view of the 32nd level. She told herself it was idle curiosity, nothing more. After all, Henry Granville was an enigma, and Ruth had always been drawn to puzzles. What she didn't know was that 30 floors above, Henry Granville was reviewing project reports and finding himself particularly impressed by the innovative analysis submitted by a certain project analyst named Ruth Gemmell. Her work was exceptional, thorough, creative, and refreshingly direct in its recommendations. And what neither of them could have predicted was that in just 4 days at the annual holiday party, a simple joke and an overheard conversation would set in motion a series of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. Because sometimes the most powerful forces in the universe are the ones we never see coming, and sometimes the most controlled people are the ones most in need of someone brave enough to surprise them. Sometimes the most ordinary Tuesday can be the calm before the most extraordinary Friday. Ruth walked into the office Tuesday morning carrying 2 coffee cups from the little shop around the corner, her favorite burgundy scarf wrapped snugly around her neck to ward off Boston's early December chill. The gesture wasn't unusual. She often brought coffee for colleagues when someone was having a rough week, but today her target was Amelia, who had been stressed about the upcoming client presentation. "You're an angel," Amelia said gratefully, accepting the steaming cup. "I've been here since 6 trying to perfect these slides, and I think I'm starting to see numbers in my sleep." "That's what friends are for," Ruth replied, settling into her desk chair and powering up her computer. "Besides, I know you'd do the same for me." Trevor rolled over in his desk chair, looking hopeful. "Any chance that coffee delivery service extends to devastatingly handsome male analysts who forgot to stop for caffeine this morning?" "Nice try," Ruth laughed, "but you're on your own, Romeo." As the morning progressed, Ruth found herself more productive than usual, powered by a strange energy she couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the approaching holidays, or maybe it was the fact that Friday's party promised to be the most elaborate event Thornfield had ever hosted. The company had spared no expense this year: a fancy venue, live music, and an open bar that was already the talk of every floor. "Have you decided what you're wearing Friday?" Bethany asked during their lunch break, her voice carrying the excitement of someone who lived for social events. "I have a few options," Ruth replied, though truthfully she'd been thinking about it more than she cared to admit. There was something about company parties that brought out everyone's competitive side, not just professionally, but personally too. "I heard they're doing actual assigned seating this year," Amelia said, unwrapping her sandwich, "like a real fancy dinner party." "Please tell me they're not putting us at the kids' table," Trevor groaned dramatically. "Relax," Ruth said with a grin. "I'm sure they'll seat us with people who can appreciate your unique brand of charm." "Speaking of charm," Bethany said with a mischievous glint in her eye, "I wonder if our mysterious CEO will actually mingle this year, or if he'll just make his usual 20-minute appearance and disappear." Ruth looked up from her salad, curious despite herself. "What's he usually like at these things?" "Professional, polite, completely untouchable," Amelia replied. "Last year, Janet from accounting tried to make conversation with him about her daughter's college graduation, and he listened with this perfectly pleasant expression and said all the right things, but you could tell he was mentally calculating quarterly projections the entire time." "Maybe he's just shy," Ruth suggested, though she wasn't sure why she was defending someone she'd never actually met. Trevor snorted. "Ruth, the man runs a multinational consulting firm. Shy people don't typically command boardrooms filled with Fortune 500 executives." "Fair point," Ruth conceded, "but still there has to be more to him than the robot persona everyone talks about." "You seem awfully interested in our enigmatic leader," Amelia observed with a knowing smile. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not interested. I'm just curious. It's like working in a building with a celebrity you never actually see." "Well," Friday's your chance, Bethany said excitedly. I heard from Margaret, his assistant, that he's planning to stay for the entire event this year. Apparently the board thinks it's good for company morale. The rest of the week passed in a blur of project deadlines and party preparation. Ruth found herself paying more attention to office gossip than usual, picking up details about Henry Granville that painted a picture of a man who was brilliant, demanding, and utterly dedicated to his work. She learned that he arrived at the office every morning at 6:30 sharp, that he preferred his coffee black, and that he'd once worked through an entire weekend to personally review a proposal that could have waited until Monday. She also learned that, despite his reputation for being cold and distant, he'd quietly arranged for the company to pay for an employee's daughter's medical treatment when insurance wouldn't cover it. "The man's a walking contradiction," Amelia said Thursday afternoon as they prepared to leave for the day. "Ice cold one minute, secretly generous the next." "Maybe he's just private," Ruth suggested. "Some people don't like to broadcast their good deeds." "Or maybe," Trevor said with exaggerated drama, "he's actually a secret romantic who's just waiting for the right woman to melt his frozen heart." "Trevor, you watch too many movies," Ruth laughed, but something about the comment stuck with her as she rode the subway home. That evening, Ruth stood in her bedroom, staring at her closet with the kind of intensity usually reserved for major life decisions. She'd narrowed it down to 3 dresses: a safe black number that was professional and elegant, a deep burgundy dress that brought out the warmth in her skin, and a stunning midnight blue gown that she'd bought on impulse but never had occasion to wear. "The midnight blue one," Destiny said decisively from her position on Ruth's bed, where she was providing expert consultation via video call from her apartment across town. "Definitely the midnight blue one." "It's not too much?" Ruth asked, holding the dress up to herself in the mirror. "Honey, you work for one of the most successful consulting firms in Boston. Nothing is too much. Besides," Destiny added with a grin, "if you're going to finally meet the mysterious Mr. Granville face to face, you might as well make an impression." "I'm not trying to make an impression," Ruth protested, though her tone lacked conviction. "Uh-huh, and I'm not trying to get promoted to senior marketing director." "Ruth, baby, there's nothing wrong with wanting to look stunning. Just don't pretend it's purely professional." Ruth examined herself in the mirror, imagining how she'd look in the elegant ballroom, surrounded by colleagues and clients. For some reason, she found herself wondering what Henry Granville would think when he saw her. Not that it mattered, of course. They'd probably exchange polite pleasantries at most. "Fine," she said finally. "The midnight blue dress it is." "Excellent choice." "And Ruth?" "Yeah?" Destiny's smile was warm and encouraging. "Whatever happens Friday night, just be yourself. You're amazing exactly as you are." As Ruth hung up the phone and laid out her chosen outfit for the next evening, she couldn't shake the feeling that Friday was going to be more significant than just another company party. There was an electricity in the air, a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with free cocktails and fancy hors d'oeuvres. What she didn't know was that 30 floors above, Henry Granville was having his own internal debate about Friday's event, specifically whether he could manage to get through an entire evening of small talk and social obligations without thinking about the sharp-witted analyst whose project reports had been impressing him for months. And what neither of them could have predicted was that a simple joke about confidence and composure would change everything they thought they knew about professional boundaries and personal desires. Some jokes are destined to change your life, and you never see them coming until it's too late to take them back. The Grand Ballroom at the Fairmont Copley Plaza had been transformed into a winter wonderland that would have made Hallmark movie producers weep with envy. Twinkling lights cascaded from the ceiling like fallen stars, elegant ice sculptures caught the ambient glow from crystal chandeliers, and enough champagne flowed to float the harbor outside. Ruth stood at the entrance, smoothing down her midnight blue dress one final time, and had to admit that Thornfield Consulting knew how to throw a party. The dress had been the right choice. She could feel it in the way the silk moved against her skin, in the confidence that seemed to radiate from her very core. The deep blue brought out the golden undertones in her coffee-brown skin, and the cut was sophisticated enough for a corporate event, while still making her feel undeniably feminine. "Girl, you look absolutely stunning," Destiny said, appearing at her side in a gorgeous burgundy gown that complemented her radiant dark skin perfectly. "If that mysterious CEO of yours doesn't notice you tonight, the man needs his eyes checked," Ruth laughed, adjusting her small evening clutch. "I'm not here to be noticed by the CEO, Des. I'm here to celebrate a successful year with my colleagues." "Uh-huh," Destiny replied with a knowing smirk. "And I'm here for the intellectual conversation. Ruth, honey, you've been talking about this man for weeks without even realizing it." Before Ruth could protest, Trevor appeared with Amelia close behind, both looking festive and clearly having pre-gamed the evening with a few cocktails. "There are our beautiful queens," Trevor called out, executing an elaborate bow that nearly sent him tumbling in his perfectly fitted tuxedo. "Ready to see if our Ice King actually knows how to have fun?" "Trevor," Amelia warned, though she was grinning in her elegant black gown. "Remember, that's still our boss you're talking about. Tonight he's just another guy in a tux," Trevor declared with the confidence of someone who'd had exactly 2 glasses of champagne. "Speaking of which, have you seen him yet? Because let me tell you, the man cleans up even better than usual." Ruth tried to appear casual, though her heart had already started beating faster. "I'm sure Mr. Granville looks very professional." Destiny shot her a look that clearly said, "You are the worst liar in the history of lying." But before she could comment, a subtle shift in the room's energy caught their attention. Conversations became slightly more subdued, postures straightened almost imperceptibly, and several heads turned toward the grand staircase that curved down into the ballroom. Henry Granville appeared at the top of the marble steps, and Ruth's breath caught in her throat. If she'd thought he was impressive in his daily business attire, seeing him in formal wear was like discovering that a beautiful painting had been hiding another masterpiece underneath. His black tuxedo was clearly custom-tailored, emphasizing his broad shoulders and lean frame while somehow making him look both more powerful and more approachable. His dark hair was styled with just enough casual elegance to suggest he was human after all, and when his steel blue eyes swept the room, Ruth felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. For just a moment, those eyes seemed to find hers across the crowded ballroom, and Ruth could have sworn time stopped. Then Henry was moving down the staircase with his usual measured grace, immediately surrounded by board members and important clients who clearly wanted to monopolize his attention. "Wow," Bethany said, appearing beside them with wide eyes. "I mean, I knew he was attractive, but that should probably come with a warning label." "Down, girl," Amelia laughed. "Remember, we're talking about a man who probably schedules his meals and times his bathroom breaks." "Maybe," Ruth said, surprising herself, "but he's still human." The next hour passed in a blur of excellent food, flowing wine, and the kind of relaxed conversation that only happened when people stepped outside their normal work roles. Ruth found herself genuinely enjoying the evening, laughing with colleagues she rarely saw outside the office, and meeting clients whose names she'd only seen on reports. But through it all, she remained acutely aware of Henry's presence. He moved through the room like a consummate professional, making conversation with various groups, always saying the right thing, always perfectly composed. Yet there was something almost lonely about it, Ruth thought, like he was performing rather than participating. It was during a lull in the evening's program, when the band had taken a break and people were gathering in smaller groups around the various bars, that Ruth found herself near the elegant windows overlooking Boston's twinkling skyline. She was chatting with a group of colleagues when the conversation took an unexpected turn. "I still can't believe he's staying for the whole event this year," Bethany was saying, gesturing subtly toward where Henry stood in conversation with several board members. "Usually he's gone before dessert is served." "Maybe he's finally learning to relax," suggested someone from the accounting department. Trevor snorted with laughter. "Relax? We're talking about a man who probably color codes his sock drawer and has never had a spontaneous moment in his entire life." "Oh, come on," Amelia said, though she was grinning. "He's not that bad. Intimidating, yes, completely controlled, absolutely, but there has to be some warmth under all that perfection." "I don't know," said Jennifer from reception, who had joined their group. "I've worked here 15 years and I've never seen him lose his composure. Not once. The man is like a machine." "Exactly," Trevor said, warming to his theme. "I bet there isn't a woman in this room who could crack that legendary self-control. The guy's unshakable." Ruth felt that familiar spark of mischief rising in her chest, the same feeling she got whenever someone made an absolute statement that begged to be challenged. Maybe it was the champagne, or maybe it was weeks of curiosity about the mysterious CEO, but something made her speak up. "That's quite a challenge, Trevor," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the group. Everyone turned to look at her, and Ruth suddenly realized she had their complete attention. There was no backing down now. "I mean, you're probably right," she continued, surprised by her own boldness. "Mr. Granville clearly has extraordinary self-control, but no one is completely unshakable." "Oh, really?" Trevor asked, his eyes lighting up with the prospect of a debate. And what exactly do you think it would take to ruffle those famous feathers? Ruth glanced across the room to where Henry stood, looking every inch the powerful CEO in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. He was listening intently to something one of the board members was saying, his expression politely interested but completely unreadable. "I don't know," Ruth said with a shrug that was pure performance. "Someone who isn't intimidated by all that perfection, I suppose. Someone willing to treat him like a regular person, instead of putting him on a pedestal." "But what kind of person could actually get to him?" Bethany pressed, clearly enjoying the speculation. Ruth paused, aware that she was about to cross a line but unable to stop herself. "Someone authentic, someone who says what they think without filtering it through corporate speak." "Like you?" Amelia asked with a grin. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she maintained her composure. "Like anyone who isn't afraid to be real around him. Though honestly," she paused dramatically, fully committed to the joke now, "I bet he couldn't handle someone like that for more than 5 minutes. 5 minutes? Trevor laughed. "Ruth, I think you're being generous. I bet he wouldn't last 2 minutes with a woman who actually challenged him." The group erupted in laughter, and Ruth grinned, caught up in the playful energy. "You're right," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "A man like that, used to everyone tiptoeing around him, he wouldn't last 2 minutes with someone who actually had the nerve to." 2 minutes, is it? The voice was unmistakably deep, controlled, and coming from directly behind her. Ruth's blood turned to ice water as she slowly turned around. Henry Granville stood less than 3 feet away, having approached their group while returning from the restroom. His steel blue eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel like a butterfly pinned to a board, and there was something in his expression, amusement mixed with challenge, that made her realize he'd heard every word. The group around her had gone completely silent, their laughter dying as if someone had flipped a switch. Ruth could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could hear the blood rushing in her ears, could sense every eye in their immediate vicinity turning to watch what would happen next. Henry stepped closer, his movements unhurried and completely controlled. When he spoke, his voice was quiet enough that only their group could hear, but it carried clearly in the sudden silence. 2 minutes, he repeated thoughtfully, as if testing the words. "That's quite a specific time frame, Ms. Gemmell." Ruth opened her mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain that it had just been a joke, but no words came out. She was drowning in those blue eyes, in the slight smile that played at the corners of his mouth, in the sudden realization that she had just publicly challenged the CEO of her company. Henry tilted his head slightly, studying her with the kind of focus usually reserved for quarterly reports and merger negotiations. "I have to admit, I'm curious about your methodology. How exactly did you arrive at that particular assessment?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Ruth wasn't sure she understood. Was he angry? Amused? Offended? His expression gave away nothing, and she realized with a sinking feeling that she was about to find out exactly what happened when Ruth Gemmell's mouth got ahead of her brain. She began, then stopped, her usual confidence deserting her completely. Henry's smile widened just a fraction, and something that might have been genuine amusement flickered in his eyes. "Because I have to tell you, Ms. Gemmell, I think you might be wrong." And in that moment, with the entire group watching and her heart pounding like a drum, Ruth realized that she had just stumbled into something far more complicated and dangerous than a simple office joke. Because the way Henry was looking at her now, like she was a puzzle he actually wanted to solve, suggested that her 2-minute assessment was about to be put to the test. Some conversations change the trajectory of your entire life, and they always happen when you least expect them. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, and Ruth could feel every eye in their immediate vicinity watching the exchange with the kind of fascination usually reserved for reality TV drama. Henry's challenge hung in the air, polite, professional, and absolutely loaded with implications that made her pulse race. "Wrong?" Ruth managed to find her voice, though it came out slightly breathier than she'd intended. "About what, specifically?" Henry's smile was subtle but unmistakably real, transforming his usually controlled expression into something that was both more human and infinitely more dangerous. "About the 2 minutes," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that their conversation felt intimate despite the crowd around them. "I have a feeling I might surprise you." The group around them exchanged glances that ranged from shocked to delighted, clearly sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Trevor looked like he might faint from the drama of it all, while Amelia was practically vibrating with barely contained excitement. Ruth felt heat rise in her cheeks, but something in Henry's tone, playful rather than offended, gave her the courage to rally. "Is that so?" she asked, lifting her chin with a confidence she didn't entirely feel. "And what makes you think that?" "Experience," Henry replied smoothly, echoing her earlier words back to her. "In my line of work, I've learned that assumptions are often incomplete." The way he said it made Ruth wonder if they were still talking about the same thing. There was something in his eyes, a warmth she'd never seen before mixed with what looked suspiciously like genuine amusement, that suggested this conversation had moved far beyond her original joke. "Well," Ruth said, surprising herself with her boldness, "I suppose there's only one way to find out who's right." Henry raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting to something that might have been intrigue. "Is that a challenge, Miss Gamble?" Before Ruth could respond, Trevor stepped forward with the kind of enthusiasm that only came from someone who'd had just enough champagne to think he was being helpful. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying clearly, "this is fascinating from a psychological perspective. Ruth here is our resident expert on reading people. She's the one who predicted the Morrison Industries merger 3 months before it was announced." "Trevor," Ruth warned, but he was already in full presentation mode. "And Mr. Granville," Trevor continued, turning to Henry with the fearless confidence of someone who clearly hadn't thought this through. "Everyone knows you're, well, let's say emotionally efficient. So this is basically an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object." Henry's attention shifted to Trevor, and Ruth watched with a mixture of horror and fascination as her colleague realized he'd just essentially called the CEO emotionally unavailable to his face. "Emotionally efficient," Henry repeated thoughtfully. "That's one way to put it." "What Trevor means," Amelia jumped in quickly, shooting Trevor a look that could have melted steel, "is that you're very professional, controlled." "Ah," Henry nodded gravely, "and Ms. Gemmell here believes that control has limits." "I believe," Ruth said, finding her footing again, "that everyone has limits. Even you." The words came out more directly than she'd intended, and for a moment, Ruth wondered if she'd finally crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But instead of looking offended, Henry seemed genuinely intrigued. "Interesting theory," he said, his voice carrying that same undertone of amusement. "And how exactly would you propose to test it?" The question hung between them, and Ruth realized with a start that they were no longer having a casual conversation at a company party. They were negotiating the terms of something she didn't quite understand, but couldn't seem to walk away from. She began, then stopped, suddenly aware that whatever she said next would determine the direction of this entire interaction. Henry waited patiently, his blue eyes never leaving her face. Around them, their colleagues had gone completely quiet, clearly sensing that they were witnessing something significant, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on what it was. "Conversation," Ruth said finally, the word coming out more confident than she felt. "Just honest conversation. No corporate speak, no professional filters, just 2 people talking." "And you think that would, what, overwhelm me somehow?" Ruth met his gaze directly, drawing on every ounce of confidence she possessed. "I think you're used to people treating you like you're made of glass and dollar signs. I think you're used to conversations that have been pre-approved and sanitized for your consumption." Something flickered in Henry's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "And you'd be different?" "I'd be real," Ruth said simply. "The question is whether you could handle that." For a long moment Henry said nothing. Ruth could see him processing her words, could almost watch him weigh options and calculate risks behind those intelligent blue eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly in the sudden hush around them. "You know what, Ms. Gemmell? I think I'd like to find out." Ruth's heart skipped. "What does that mean exactly?" Henry glanced around at their audience, then back at her with what might have been the first completely genuine smile she'd ever seen from him. "It means I'm accepting your challenge. Dinner tomorrow night. Somewhere we can have that honest conversation you mentioned." The group around them erupted in barely contained excitement, though they tried to maintain some semblance of professionalism. Ruth heard Destiny's sharp intake of breath beside her, and Trevor's muttered, "Holy shit," that he tried unsuccessfully to cover with a cough. "Dinner?" Ruth repeated, her mind racing to catch up with what had just happened. "Unless you're not as confident in your assessment as you seemed," Henry said, and there was definitely challenge in his voice now, mixed with something that looked suspiciously like hope. Ruth stared at him, this man who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions, looking at her like her answer actually mattered to him, like she was a puzzle he genuinely wanted to solve, rather than an employee he needed to manage. She began, then stopped, realizing that every person within hearing distance was waiting for her response. Henry seemed to sense her hesitation. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "It's just dinner, Ruth. Two people having an honest conversation, nothing more complicated than that, unless you want it to be." The use of her first name sent a shiver through her, made this feel suddenly personal in a way that had nothing to do with their audience or her original joke. "Okay," she heard herself say, the word coming out before her rational mind could interfere. "Dinner." Henry's smile transformed his entire face, making him look younger and infinitely more approachable. "Excellent. I'll have Margaret contact you with the details." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card, but instead of handing it to her normally, he held it between two fingers and offered it to her with a slight bow that was both formal and completely playful. "Ms. Gemmell," he said, his voice carrying just enough humor to make it clear he was enjoying himself. "I look forward to discovering whether your confidence in your people-reading abilities is justified." Ruth took the card, her fingers brushing against his for just a moment. The contact sent electricity up her arm, and she wondered if he felt it too. "Mr. Granville," she replied, matching his formal tone while her heart raced. "I look forward to proving my point." "We'll see about that," Henry said quietly, then straightened and addressed the group with his usual professional demeanor. "Please don't let me interrupt your evening. I hope everyone is enjoying the party." With that, he moved away with his characteristic grace, leaving Ruth standing with a business card in her hand, and the distinct feeling that her life had just taken a sharp turn into uncharted territory. The moment Henry was out of earshot, their group exploded into excited chatter. "Oh my God, Ruth," Bethany practically squeaked. "Did that actually just happen? Did you just get asked out by Henry Granville?" Amelia demanded, her eyes wide with disbelief. "It's not a date," Ruth said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's just dinner, to settle a debate." Destiny appeared at her side, her expression caught between amazement and concern. "Honey, that man was not looking at you like someone he wants to debate with." Ruth looked down at the business card in her hand. It was simple, elegant, expensive, just like everything else about Henry Granville. But written on the back in what was clearly his handwriting was a single word: courage. As she stared at that single word, Ruth realized that Henry Granville had just thrown down a gauntlet of his own. The question was whether she was brave enough to pick it up, and whether either of them was prepared for what might happen when an unstoppable force really did meet an immovable object. Some evenings are designed to change everything you thought you knew about yourself and someone else. Ruth stood in front of her full-length mirror, holding up two dresses and questioning every life choice that had led her to this moment. The safe choice was an elegant black wrap dress, professional enough to maintain the pretense that this was just a business dinner, but sophisticated enough to make her feel confident. The bold choice was a deep emerald green dress that brought out the golden undertones in her brown skin and made her feel like the kind of woman who could challenge CEOs and win. "The green one," Destiny said decisively from her position on Ruth's bed, where she was providing expert consultation while painting her nails a fierce shade of burgundy. "Definitely the green one." "This isn't actually a date," Ruth protested, though her tone lacked conviction. "It's more like an intellectual exercise, a debate settlement." Destiny snorted with laughter. "Honey, men like Henry Granville don't take women to dinner to settle debates. They send emails for that." She looked up from her nails with a knowing expression. "That man asked you out because he wants to get to know you. The real you." "You think?" Ruth asked, turning to examine herself in the green dress. It did look stunning, she had to admit. "I know. I saw the way he was looking at you last night. That wasn't the look of a man interested in winning an argument. That was the look of a man who's fascinated by something he can't quite figure out." 2 hours later, Ruth stood outside Le Bernardin, one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants, smoothing down her emerald dress and trying to calm her racing heart. The choice to wear the green dress had been the right one. She could feel it in the way she carried herself, in the confidence that seemed to radiate from her very core. The restaurant was exactly what she'd expected from Henry Granville's choice: elegant, understated, and undoubtedly expensive. Soft lighting cast warm shadows across cream-colored walls, adorned with subtle artwork, while the gentle murmur of conversation and the soft clink of fine china created an atmosphere of intimate sophistication. "Miss Gemmell," the maitre d' approached with a smile that suggested he'd been expecting her. "Mr. Granville is waiting for you. Right this way, please." Ruth followed him through the restaurant, aware of the approving glances her dress was drawing, but focused entirely on what lay ahead. When they reached a secluded corner table with an excellent view of the harbor, she saw Henry rise to greet her, and her breath caught in her throat. Gone was the intimidating CEO in the perfect suit. Instead, Henry wore a navy blue blazer over dark jeans and a white button-down shirt open at the collar. His hair was slightly less perfectly styled than usual, as if he'd run his hands through it, and when he smiled at her, it was completely genuine. "Ruth," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice. Warmer, more personal. "You look absolutely stunning." "Thank you," she replied, accepting the chair he held out for her. "You look pretty good yourself, very un-CEO-like." Henry laughed, a sound that was rich and genuine and nothing like the polite chuckles she'd heard from him in professional settings. "I thought maybe we should start this experiment on equal footing. No corporate armor." As they settled at the table, Ruth found herself studying this version of Henry Granville with fascination. Without the formal suit and the boardroom setting, he looked younger, more approachable, undeniably attractive in a way that had nothing to do with power or prestige. "So," Henry said after they'd ordered wine and studied their menus, "tell me about this theory of yours, the one about me not being able to handle honest conversation." Ruth leaned back in her chair, meeting his gaze directly. "It's not that you can't handle it, it's that you've probably never experienced it. When you're the most powerful person in every room you enter, people tend to curate their interactions with you." "Curate?" Henry repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting way to put it." "Think about it," Ruth continued, warming to her theme. "When was the last time someone disagreed with you? Really disagreed, not just offered a polite alternative perspective?" Henry was quiet for a moment, considering. "Longer ago than I'd care to admit," he said finally. "And when was the last time someone told you you were wrong about something?" "Are you about to?" Henry asked with a smile that was both amused and challenging. "Probably," Ruth replied without hesitation. "I have very strong opinions about most things, and I'm not particularly good at keeping them to myself." Their wine arrived, and Ruth watched as Henry went through the tasting ritual with practiced ease. But when he caught her observing him, he paused. "What?" he asked. "I'm trying to figure out if that's really you or if it's just another performance," Ruth said honestly. Henry set down his wine glass, his expression shifting to something more serious. "What do you mean? I mean, are you genuinely someone who knows about wine, or is this just another thing you learned because it's expected of someone in your position?" For a moment, Ruth worried she'd crossed a line, but then Henry's expression shifted to something that looked like surprise, followed by what might have been relief. "Both," he said quietly. "I do genuinely enjoy wine. I started learning about it in college because I was curious. But you're right that it's also become part of the performance, I suppose." Ruth felt something shift between them, a wall coming down that she hadn't even realized was there. "See? That wasn't so hard, was it?" "What wasn't hard?" "Being honest about something real instead of just giving me the answer you think I want to hear." Henry studied her for a long moment, his blue eyes serious. "You really don't care about any of it, do you? The money, the power, the position." "Should I?" Ruth asked. "I mean, I'm impressed by what you've accomplished. Building a company like Thornfield takes incredible skill and dedication, but I'm more interested in who you are when you're not being the CEO." "And who do you think that is?" Ruth considered the question carefully, studying his face in the candlelight. "I think you're someone who's been performing for so long that you've forgotten some of who you really are. I think you're probably funny and definitely lonely, and maybe a little tired of always having to be perfect." Henry's wineglass stopped halfway to his lips. "That's remarkably perceptive. Also probably presumptuous," Ruth admitted. "I could be completely wrong." "You're not," Henry said quietly. "You're absolutely right, and it's terrifying." "Why terrifying?" "Because if someone I've known for less than 24 hours can see through me that easily, what does that say about the facade I've built?" Ruth leaned forward, her voice gentle but direct. "It says you're ready to let someone see the real you. The question is whether you're brave enough to do it." Their food arrived, providing a natural break in the intensity of their conversation. But as they ate, Ruth noticed that Henry seemed more relaxed, more genuinely present than she'd ever seen him. "Your turn," Henry said, as they shared a dessert that was almost too beautiful to eat. "Tell me something real about Ruth Gemmell." "What do you want to know?" "Something you don't usually tell people. Something that matters to you." Ruth considered the question, twirling her spoon through the elegant chocolate creation between them. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said finally. "Elementary school. I had this whole plan. I was going to teach in underserved communities, make a real difference in kids' lives. What changed? Reality, I suppose. Student loans, the need for a steady income, the pressure to use my analytical skills in something more practical. She looked up at him with a slight smile. Turns out I'm good at reading numbers and trends, but what I really love is reading people. Is that what you're doing with me? Reading me? I'm trying to understand you, Ruth said honestly. You're complicated. Complicated how? You're this incredibly successful, powerful man who seems to have everything anyone could want. But there's something in your eyes that looks almost sad, like you're successful at everything except the things that really matter. Henry set down his spoon, his expression shifting to something vulnerable. And what do you think really matters? Connection, authenticity, having someone who sees you for who you really are and likes you anyway. Is that what you're offering? Henry asked quietly. Ruth met his gaze directly, feeling the weight of the moment. I'm offering honesty. The rest, we'll have to see. As they sat there in the soft candlelight, sharing dessert and truths that neither of them usually revealed, Ruth realized that her 2-minute assessment had been completely wrong. Henry Granville wasn't someone who couldn't handle authenticity. He was someone who'd been starving for it. And the way he was looking at her now, like she was offering him something precious and rare, made her wonder if she was ready for whatever came next. Some discoveries change everything you thought you knew about falling in love. Ruth walked into the office Monday morning with a secret smile playing at her lips, and the kind of glow that came from spending a Saturday evening discovering that your assumptions about someone were beautifully, completely wrong. The emerald dress had been carefully hung in her closet, but the memory of Henry's genuine laughter, his vulnerable admissions, and the way he'd looked at her when she'd challenged his carefully constructed facade lingered like the most perfect perfume. Someone looks like they had an excellent weekend, Amelia observed, as Ruth settled at her desk, her usual Monday morning grumpiness notably absent. Just a good night's sleep, Ruth replied, though she couldn't quite suppress her smile. Trevor rolled over in his desk chair, studying her with the intensity of someone who lived for office drama. Ruth Gemmell, you are glowing, and not in a "I used a new moisturizer" way. You're glowing in a "something wonderful happened" way. Don't be ridiculous, Ruth said, but she was still smiling as she powered up her computer. What she didn't mention was the text message that had been waiting for her when she woke up. Thank you for last night. For the first time in years, I remembered what it feels like to just be myself. She'd stared at that message for a full 5 minutes, her heart doing something complicated in her chest. The Henry Granville she'd had dinner with, the one who'd laughed at her stories about her college roommate's disastrous cooking experiments, who'd admitted that he sometimes missed the simplicity of his family's bookstore, who'd looked genuinely disappointed when the evening ended, was so different from the controlled CEO everyone thought they knew. Her phone buzzed with a new message. I know this is unconventional, but would you be available for lunch today? I have something I'd like to show you. Ruth stared at the screen, her pulse quickening. Before she could second-guess herself, she typed back, I'd like that. When and where? The response came almost immediately. Margaret will send you details. And Ruth, wear comfortable shoes. Comfortable shoes? Ruth murmured to herself, intrigued. Did you say something? Bethany asked, looking up from her computer. Just talking to myself, Ruth replied, but her mind was already racing with possibilities. An hour later, Margaret called down to inform her that Mr. Granville's driver would be picking her up at noon for a lunch appointment. The phrasing was carefully professional, but Ruth caught the hint of warmth in the older woman's voice that suggested she knew this was anything but a typical business lunch. At exactly 12 o'clock, Ruth found herself in the back of a sleek black car with Henry, who looked more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. He wore dark jeans and a grey sweater that made his blue eyes even more striking, and his hair had that slightly mussed look that suggested he'd been running his hands through it. So where are we going? Ruth asked as they pulled away from the Thornfield building. Somewhere I haven't been in far too long, Henry replied, his eyes bright with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. Somewhere that reminds me of who I used to be, before I became the person everyone expects me to be. They drove through Boston's winding streets, past the business district, and into a neighborhood Ruth recognized as one of the city's more charming areas, tree-lined streets with brownstones and small shops that had the kind of character that came from decades of history. The car stopped in front of a small bookstore with a hand-painted sign that read, Granville and Sons Books, in elegant script. Ruth looked at Henry with surprise and delight. This is your family's bookstore? Henry nodded, something vulnerable flickering across his features. The flagship location. My father opened it 42 years ago. He paused, studying the familiar storefront. I haven't been inside in almost 3 years. Why not? Because every time I come here, I remember the person I thought I'd become, and that person feels very far away from the CEO everyone knows. Ruth reached over and touched his hand gently. Maybe it's time to introduce those two people to each other. The inside of the bookstore was exactly what Ruth had imagined, cozy and warm, with floor-to-ceiling shelves, comfortable reading chairs, and the kind of atmosphere that made you want to spend hours browsing. The scent of old books and fresh coffee created an ambience that was both intellectual and homey. "Henry," a woman's voice called out from behind the register. Ruth turned to see a petite woman with silver-streaked brown hair and eyes that were unmistakably related to Henry's. "I can't believe it. You actually came." "Hello, Mom," Henry said, his voice softer than Ruth had ever heard it. The transformation was immediate. His posture relaxed, his expression became genuinely warm, and suddenly Ruth could see the young man he must have been before corporate responsibility shaped him into the controlled executive she'd first met. "And you brought a friend," his mother continued, turning to Ruth with a smile that was both curious and welcoming. "Mom, this is Ruth Gemmell." "Ruth, my mother, Eleanor Granville." "It's wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Granville," Ruth said, extending her hand. "Please call me Eleanor. And it's wonderful to meet you too, dear. Henry never brings friends to the store." She shot her son a meaningful look. "In fact, Henry never brings anyone anywhere. He's become far too serious since he took over that consulting business." "Mom," Henry said, but he was smiling. "Don't mom me. You used to love this place. You used to spend hours here, reading everything we had about ancient civilizations and economic theory. Now you show up once every few years looking like you've forgotten how to relax." Ruth watched this exchange with fascination, seeing a side of Henry she'd never imagined. Here, surrounded by books and his mother's gentle teasing, he looked like a completely different person. Younger, more open, undeniably more himself. "Why don't I show Ruth around while you catch up with your mother?" Henry suggested, but Eleanor waved them both toward the back of the store. "Nonsense, I want to hear all about how you two met. And Ruth, I want to know what you've done to make my son smile like that." They spent the next 2 hours wandering through the store, with Eleanor regaling Ruth with stories about Henry's childhood, how he'd organize his toys by historical period, how he'd once tried to start a lending library in their garage, how he'd read voraciously but always with a focus on understanding how societies rose and fell. "He was going to be a professor, you know," Eleanor said, as they sat in the small cafe area with coffee and homemade cookies. "Had his whole dissertation planned out about the economic factors in the decline of the Roman Empire." "What changed?" Ruth asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Life," Henry said quietly. "Responsibility. The realization that sometimes you have to choose between what you want and what your family needs." Ruth saw the flash of old pain in his eyes and understood suddenly why he carried himself with such careful control. He'd given up his dreams to save his family's legacy, had transformed himself into someone he'd never planned to become. "But you know what?" Eleanor said, reaching over to squeeze her son's hand. "I think he's starting to remember who he really is, and I have a feeling," she looked meaningfully at Ruth, "that has something to do with present company." As they walked back through the store, Ruth found herself seeing Henry in an entirely new light. This wasn't just the successful CEO who commanded boardrooms. This was a man who'd sacrificed his own dreams for his family, who'd built walls around himself to protect against the disappointment of becoming someone he'd never planned to be. "Thank you," Henry said quietly as they stood among the history section, surrounded by the books he'd once dreamed of studying professionally, "for coming here with me, for meeting my mother, for—" He paused, searching for words. "For helping me remember." "Remember what?" "That the person I used to be doesn't have to be incompatible with the person I've become." He turned to face her fully, his blue eyes serious and warm. "Yesterday at dinner, you asked me who I am when I'm not being the CEO. I think I'm starting to remember." Ruth felt her heart skip at the intensity in his gaze. "And who is that?" "Someone who believes that the most important things in life can't be measured in quarterly reports. Someone who thinks that understanding people is more valuable than understanding profit margins. Someone who—" He paused, stepping closer. "Someone who hasn't felt this interested in another person in longer than he cares to admit." The words hung between them in the quiet bookstore, honest and vulnerable and completely sincere. Ruth realized that this was what she'd been challenging him to find, Not just honesty about business or surface-level authenticity, but the courage to acknowledge what he really wanted from life. "Henry," she began, but he shook his head gently. "I know this is complicated. I know there are professional considerations and power dynamics, and a dozen reasons why this might not be wise. But Ruth," he reached out to touch her hand, his fingers warm and slightly trembling. "I can't pretend that dinner last night was just about settling a debate, and I can't pretend that bringing you here today was just about showing you my family's business." Ruth looked into his eyes and saw everything he wasn't saying, hope and uncertainty, and the kind of longing that came from someone who'd been professionally successful but personally isolated for far too long. "Then don't pretend," she said quietly. "Be real. Tell me what you actually want." Henry's smile was slow and genuine and completely transformative. "I want to see where this goes. Carefully, honestly, but hopefully. I want to find out if the person I am when I'm with you is someone I can learn to be all the time." And standing there among the books that represented dreams deferred but not forgotten, Ruth realized that her 2-minute assessment hadn't just been wrong, it had been completely backwards. Henry Granville wasn't someone who couldn't handle authenticity. He was someone who'd been waiting his entire adult life for someone brave enough to offer it. Some relationships require you to rewrite all the rules you thought you understood about love and professional boundaries. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Ruth would arrive at work each morning, exchange polite professional greetings with Henry when their paths crossed in the building, and spend her days analyzing spreadsheets and client reports while her mind wandered to stolen text messages and carefully planned encounters that had nothing to do with quarterly projections. They met for coffee at a small cafe 3 blocks from the office, where Henry would arrive first and Ruth would join him 10 minutes later, maintaining the careful fiction that these were chance encounters. They discovered they both loved old movies and terrible puns, that Henry could make Ruth laugh until her sides hurt with his dry observations about corporate culture, and that Ruth could make Henry forget entirely about the dozen meetings waiting for him, with her stories about her grandmother's advice on everything from cooking to life philosophy. "You realize we're being ridiculously careful about this," Ruth said one Thursday afternoon as they sat in the back corner of a bookstore cafe, their regular meeting spot that felt safely removed from the Thornfield building and its potential complications. Henry looked up from his coffee, where he'd been drawing absent patterns with his spoon, a nervous habit Ruth had begun to recognize. "Careful is probably an understatement," he admitted. "We're being nearly paranoid. The question is whether that's necessary, or if we're just making this more complicated than it needs to be." "Ruth," Henry said gently, "I'm the CEO of a major consulting firm, and you're an employee. If this goes public before we figure out what this actually is, it could damage both our careers. Mine because it raises questions about professional judgment, and yours because people will assume you got where you are through something other than merit." Ruth sipped her latte, considering. She appreciated that he was thinking about her career, but the constant secrecy was beginning to feel exhausting. "So what do you suggest? We keep sneaking around indefinitely?" "I suggest we take it one day at a time and see where we end up." Henry reached across the table to touch her hand briefly. "But I also suggest we be honest about what we're both feeling." "And what are you feeling?" Henry was quiet for a moment, his blue eyes serious as he studied her face. "I'm feeling like I haven't been this happy in years. I'm feeling like every conversation with you makes me remember things about myself I'd forgotten. And I'm feeling terrified that I'm falling for someone in a way that could complicate everything I've built." Ruth felt her heart skip at his honesty. "All of that?" "All of that," Henry confirmed. "Your turn." Ruth took a breath, gathering courage. "I'm feeling like you're nothing like what I expected, and everything I didn't know I was looking for. I'm feeling like this could be something really important if we let it, and I'm feeling frustrated that we have to treat something this good like it's some kind of scandal." "It's not a scandal," Henry said quietly, "but it is complicated." Before Ruth could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Amelia. "Emergency girl talk needed. Wine bar across from office, 6 p.m. Don't even think about saying no." Ruth showed Henry the message with a rueful smile. "I think my careful friend is getting suspicious about my recent good mood. Are you going to tell her?" "I don't know. Are we at the telling friends stage?" Henry considered this question with the same seriousness he brought to major business decisions. "I'd like to be, but I understand if you're not ready for that level of reality." Ruth studied his face, seeing both hope and uncertainty there. "What about you?" Anyone you'd want to tell? My mother already knows something's different. She called yesterday to tell me I sounded happier than I have in years, and to ask when she was going to meet the woman who's made my son remember how to laugh. She said that? Eleanor Granville is not subtle about matters of the heart. Henry smiled, but then his expression grew more serious. Ruth, I need you to know that whatever this becomes, I'm not taking it lightly. You're not just some distraction or midlife crisis. This feels important. The words settled between them with weight and promise. Ruth realized they'd crossed some invisible line. This was no longer just casual dating or an intellectual exercise in breaking down each other's walls. This was becoming something real. It feels important to me too, she said quietly. That evening, Ruth found herself at Vintner's Choice, the wine bar Amelia had chosen for their emergency girl talk. Amelia was already there, having claimed a corner table with excellent people-watching potential and questionable acoustic privacy. Okay, Amelia said without preamble, as Ruth settled into her chair. I need to know what's going on with you. What do you mean? Ruth asked, though she suspected subterfuge was futile. I mean, you've been walking around with this secret smile for 3 weeks. You disappear at lunch without explanation. You get text messages that make you glow like you're starring in a romantic comedy. And yesterday I swear I saw you humming. I hum sometimes. You hummed Fly Me to the Moon while reviewing budget projections. Ruth, nobody hums jazz standards over spreadsheets unless they're in love. Ruth nearly choked on her wine. In love? Don't you think that's a little premature? Is it? Amelia leaned forward with the intensity of someone who lived for romantic drama. Because from where I'm sitting, all signs point to a woman who's fallen hard for someone. The question is who? Ruth stared into her wine glass, weighing the relief of confession against the complications of revelation. It's complicated. The best ones always are. Come on, Ruth. We've been friends for 2 years. You can trust me. And Ruth realized suddenly that she wanted to tell someone. The careful secrecy was wonderful in its own way, but she missed having someone to talk through her feelings with, missed the luxury of analyzing every conversation and gesture with a trusted friend. If I tell you something, can you promise to keep it completely confidential? At least for now. Amelia's eyes widened with excitement and concern. Of course. Ruth, what's going on? Ruth took a deep breath and made the leap. I'm seeing someone from work. From work? Amelia's eyebrows shot up. Who, Trevor? Because I have to tell you, I've always suspected he has feelings for... Not Trevor, Ruth interrupted quickly. Then who? Wait. Amelia's expression shifted as she began processing possibilities. Ruth, you're not telling me it's someone senior, are you? Because that could be really complicated from an HR perspective. Amelia. Oh my God. Amelia's voice dropped to a whisper as understanding dawned. Ruth, please tell me you're not... It's not. Ruth met her friend's eyes and saw the exact moment when all the pieces clicked into place. Henry Granville? Amelia breathed. You're seeing Henry Granville? Ruth nodded, feeling both relief and terror at having finally said it out loud to someone other than herself. Holy shit, Amelia whispered, then immediately looked around to make sure no one had overheard. Ruth, the CEO, our CEO, the man we've spent months talking about like he's some kind of untouchable ice sculpture. He's not untouchable, Ruth said quietly, and he's definitely not ice. Amelia stared at her for a long moment, then reached across the table to grab Ruth's hands. Start from the beginning, and don't leave out a single detail. As Ruth began to tell the story, from the party challenge to the dinner to the bookstore to the coffee dates that had become the highlight of her days, she realized that sharing it made it feel more real. But it also made the complications feel more daunting, because now it wasn't just her secret anymore. Now it was something that existed in the world, with all the beautiful possibilities and terrifying risks that entailed. Sometimes the moment you stop hiding something is the moment you realize how much you have to lose. Ruth spent the weekend replaying her conversation with Amelia, alternating between relief at finally having someone to talk to and anxiety about what sharing the secret might mean. Amelia had been surprisingly supportive, shocked, yes, but ultimately excited for Ruth and appropriately concerned about the professional implications. You know I'm going to want details about everything, Amelia had said as they'd parted ways Friday night. But more importantly, Ruth, you know I'm on your side no matter what, right? The support meant everything, but it also made the situation feel more real and more complicated. Monday morning brought an unexpected text from Henry. Can you meet me in my office at 10? We need to talk. H. Ruth stared at the message, her stomach dropping. The formal tone was so different from their usual communication that she immediately began imagining worst-case scenarios. Had someone seen them together? Had word gotten back to the board? Was he ending things before they got more complicated? At exactly 10 o'clock, Ruth knocked on Henry's office door, her professional mask firmly in place despite the way her heart was racing. "Come in," Henry's voice called, and Ruth entered to find him standing at his windows looking out over Boston's skyline with an expression she couldn't read. "You wanted to see me?" Ruth said carefully, maintaining the professional tone his text had suggested. Henry turned, and Ruth was relieved to see warmth in his blue eyes, though there was also something that looked like concern. "Close the door, please." Ruth did as he asked, then moved toward his desk, unsure whether to sit or stand, unsure what role she was supposed to be playing in this moment. "I got an interesting call this morning," Henry said without preamble. "From James Whitfield." Ruth's blood turned cold. James Whitfield was the chairman of Thornfield's board of directors, a man whose opinion could make or break careers. He wanted to discuss some observations that had been brought to his attention about my recent behavior. "What kind of observations?" Ruth asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Henry moved closer, his voice dropping. "Apparently I've seemed unusually relaxed in recent weeks. More approachable, more human," was how he put it. Henry's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. He wanted to know if I was taking some kind of new medication. Ruth blinked. "That's not what I expected you to say. It gets better." When I told him no medication, just some positive changes in my personal life, he said he was pleased to hear it. Apparently the board has been concerned for years that I was too isolated, too focused on work at the expense of personal happiness. "They've been concerned about your personal happiness. According to James, a CEO who has no life outside the office is a CEO who's headed for burnout. He said they've been hoping I'd find some kind of personal fulfillment that might make me less likely to work myself into an early grave." Ruth processed this information, feeling a mixture of relief and confusion. "So, they're happy that you seem happier." Henry nodded, but his expression grew more serious. "But here's the thing, Ruth. James also mentioned that there have been some questions about who might be responsible for this positive change. A few people have noticed that we've both been absent from the building at similar times. Margaret has been deflecting questions about my lunch schedule, and apparently Trevor mentioned to someone in HR that you've been mysteriously cheerful lately." Ruth felt her stomach drop again. Trevor talked to HR, not maliciously. He was apparently just making conversation about how nice it was to see you so happy, but it got people thinking. Ruth sank into one of the chairs facing Henry's desk, the weight of the situation settling over her. "So what does this mean? Are we in trouble?" Henry moved to sit in the chair beside her rather than behind his desk, a gesture that felt both intimate and reassuring. "I don't think we're in trouble exactly, but I think we're at a crossroads." "What kind of crossroads?" Henry was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "The kind where we have to decide whether we're going to keep sneaking around indefinitely or whether we're going to acknowledge that this is something real and worth the complications." Ruth studied his face, seeing determination mixed with uncertainty. "And what do you think we should do?" "I think," Henry said slowly, "that I'm tired of pretending you're just another employee when you've become the most important part of my day. I think I'm tired of careful choreography and secret meetings when what I really want is to take you to dinner at a nice restaurant without worrying about who might see us." Ruth felt her heart skip. "Henry, I know it's asking a lot. I know there will be gossip and speculation and probably some uncomfortable conversations with HR. But Ruth, I also know that what we have is worth it." He reached over to take her hand. "The question is whether you think so too." Ruth looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. She saw hope there and vulnerability, and the kind of quiet determination that had probably made him successful in business, but felt entirely personal in this moment. "I do think it's worth it," she said quietly, "but I'm scared about what it might mean for my career, for both our careers." "So am I," Henry admitted, "but I'm more scared of losing this because we're too afraid to fight for it." Before Ruth could respond, Margaret's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Granville, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have the Morrison Industries conference call in 5 minutes." Henry closed his eyes briefly, clearly frustrated by the intrusion of reality. "Thank you, Margaret, I'll be ready." He turned back to Ruth, his expression urgent. "I know this is a lot to process. I know I'm asking you to take a leap of faith with me. But Ruth," he squeezed her hand gently, I don't want to hide anymore. I want to see where this goes when we don't have to pretend it's not happening. Ruth stared at him, this man who commanded boardrooms and made million-dollar decisions, looking at her like her answer was the most important thing in the world. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. I'm proposing we stop sneaking around. I'm proposing we have an honest conversation with HR about our relationship and make sure we're following all the appropriate protocols. I'm proposing we stop letting fear make our decisions for us. Ruth felt something shift inside her, a wall of caution crumbling in the face of his sincerity. And then what? Henry's smile was slow and genuine and completely transformative. And then, I'd like to take you to dinner Saturday night. Somewhere nice, somewhere public, somewhere I can hold your hand without worrying about who might see us. Ruth looked into his eyes and saw everything she'd been hoping for. Courage and commitment, and the kind of certainty that came from someone who'd finally decided what really mattered to him. Okay, she heard herself say, the word coming out stronger than she'd expected. Let's stop hiding. Henry's expression lit up like sunrise. Really? Really? But Henry? Ruth squeezed his hand. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Professional protocols, clear boundaries at work, and absolutely no special treatment, because we're whatever we are. Agreed, Henry said immediately, though I should probably mention that whatever we are is starting to feel like something pretty serious to me. Ruth felt warmth spread through her chest. It feels pretty serious to me, too. As they sat there in his office, hands joined and hearts aligned, Ruth realized that they'd just made a decision that would change everything. But for the first time since this all began, she wasn't afraid of the change. She was ready for it. Some moments require more courage than others, and the moment you stop hiding your happiness is often the scariest of all. Saturday evening arrived with the kind of crisp December air that made Boston look like a postcard, and Ruth stood in front of her mirror for the third time, second-guessing her outfit choice. She'd finally settled on a deep burgundy dress that was elegant enough for whatever upscale restaurant Henry had chosen, but comfortable enough that she wouldn't spend the evening tugging at the fabric or worrying about walking in heels that were too high. Her phone buzzed with a text. I'm outside. Take your time, but I should mention that I'm nervous enough for both of us. H. Ruth smiled, feeling some of her own anxiety ease. There was something reassuring about knowing that Henry, who commanded boardrooms and negotiated million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, was nervous about their first real date. She grabbed her coat and headed downstairs, where she found Henry leaning against a sleek black car, looking devastating in a charcoal suit that emphasized his tall frame and broad shoulders. When he saw her, his face lit up with the kind of smile that made her remember why she'd been willing to take this leap in the first place. You look incredible, he said, moving forward to help her with her coat. The gesture was both chivalrous and intimate, and Ruth found herself appreciating this more relaxed version of Henry, still polished and put together, but without the careful armor of his CEO persona. You clean up pretty well yourself, Ruth replied, allowing herself to really look at him now that they weren't hiding. Though I have to say, you look almost relaxed. That's because I am relaxed. For the first time in weeks, I don't have to worry about who might see us or what it might mean. I can just enjoy being with you. The restaurant Henry had chosen was exactly what Ruth had expected. Elegant but not ostentatious, with the kind of atmosphere that suggested serious food and serious conversations. What she hadn't expected was the way Henry seemed to transform the moment they were seated. The careful control she'd always associated with him was replaced by something warmer and more genuine. So, Henry said, as they perused their menus, I should probably mention that I called James Whitfield yesterday. Ruth looked up, surprised. You called the board chairman about us? I called him to have a conversation about appropriate protocols for executive relationships within the company. I wanted to make sure we were handling this correctly from a corporate governance perspective. Ruth felt a flutter of nervousness. And what did he say? Henry's expression shifted to something that might have been amusement. He said, and I quote, "It's about damn time you found someone who makes you smile." Then he spent 20 minutes telling me about how he met his wife at work 43 years ago, and how the best relationships often come from shared professional respect. He said that? He said that. He also said that as long as we maintain appropriate boundaries at work and file the necessary disclosure paperwork, the board considers this a positive development in my personal life. Ruth processed this information, feeling a mixture of relief and disbelief. So we have official board approval? We have official board support, Henry corrected with a smile. Apparently, they've been worried about my work-life balance for years. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their server, and Ruth found herself studying Henry as he ordered wine with the same attention to detail she'd observed in business settings, but with an ease that suggested genuine enjoyment rather than performance. "You know," Ruth said as they waited for their appetizers, "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for this to be too good to be true. What would convince you it's real?" Ruth considered the question, twirling her wineglass between her fingers. "I suppose, seeing how we handle the normal, boring parts of a relationship, the parts that aren't dinner at expensive restaurants or dramatic declarations in corner offices." Henry leaned forward, his blue eyes serious. "What kind of normal, boring parts?" "I don't know, grocery shopping, arguing about what to watch on TV, meeting each other's friends without it being a dramatic revelation." Ruth paused, realizing something. "Actually, I'd like you to meet Destiny properly, as my whatever you are, not just as the mysterious CEO I've been talking about." "I'd like that too," Henry said immediately, "and I'd like you to spend more time with my mother. She's already decided she likes you, but I think she'd enjoy getting to know you when I'm not having an identity crisis in the middle of a bookstore." The easy way he said it made Ruth realize how much had changed between them. The careful choreography of their secret relationship had been replaced by something that felt natural and sustainable. Their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice calling out across the restaurant. "Ruth? Ruth Gemmell?" Ruth turned to see Bradley from marketing approaching their table with a woman she didn't recognize, both of them clearly dressed for their own romantic evening out. Ruth felt a moment of panic. This was it, the moment their relationship became public knowledge within the company. "Bradley, hi," Ruth said, managing to keep her voice steady. "How are you?" "I'm great, thanks." "Ruth, this is my fiancée, Sarah." "Sarah, this is Ruth from work." Bradley's gaze shifted to Henry, and Ruth could see the exact moment when recognition dawned. "And Mr. Granville, I didn't expect to see you here." Henry stood smoothly, extending his hand to Bradley. "Bradley, good to see you. And congratulations on your engagement. I remember seeing the announcement in the company newsletter." "Thank you, sir. That's very kind of you to remember." Bradley looked between Ruth and Henry with obvious curiosity. "Are you two—" Ruth felt Henry's hand settle gently on her shoulder, a gesture that was both supportive and clearly proprietary. "Ruth and I are having dinner," Henry said simply, his tone pleasant, but not inviting further questions. Bradley's eyes widened slightly as he processed the implications, but his expression remained friendly. "Well, that's wonderful. Ruth's one of our best analysts. You couldn't ask for better company." "I completely agree," Henry replied with a smile that was both professional and genuinely warm. After Bradley and his fiancée moved on to their own table, Ruth found herself laughing despite her nerves. "What's funny?" Henry asked as he settled back into his chair. "I was expecting that to be more dramatic. Instead, it was just normal, like we're a normal couple having dinner." "We are a normal couple having dinner," Henry pointed out. "We just happen to work for the same company." Ruth looked across the table at him. This man who'd been a mystery for so long, who'd turned out to be nothing like what she'd expected, and everything she hadn't known she was looking for. "Henry," she said quietly, "I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable and completely sincere. Henry's expression shifted to something that was equal parts wonder and relief. "Ruth," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand, "I think I fell in love with you the night you told me I wouldn't last 2 minutes with someone like you." Ruth felt her heart skip. "Really? Really? You were so confident, so completely yourself, so unimpressed by everything that usually intimidates people about me. I think I knew right then that you were going to change everything." Ruth looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face. "And are you okay with everything being changed?" Henry's smile was slow and genuine, and completely transformative. "Ruth, everything being changed is the best thing that's happened to me in years." As they sat there in the elegant restaurant, no longer hiding their happiness from the world, Ruth realized that this was what courage looked like. Not the dramatic gesture or the grand declaration, but the quiet decision to stop being afraid of your own joy. And looking at Henry, who was no longer the untouchable CEO, but simply the man who made her laugh and challenged her thinking, and looked at her like she was the most important thing in his world, she knew that every risk they'd taken to get here had been worth it. Some stories end where they began, but with everything transformed by the journey between. 1 year later, Ruth stood in front of her bedroom mirror, smoothing down a stunning deep burgundy dress that brought out the golden undertones in her brown skin and made her feel like a woman who had conquered the world. The dress was different from the midnight blue one she'd worn to last year's holiday party, but the confidence was the same, perhaps even stronger now, tempered by a year of growth, challenge, and the kind of love that made everything else feel possible. "You ready for this?" Destiny asked from her position on Ruth's bed, where she was putting the finishing touches on her makeup. Over the past year, Destiny had become not just Ruth's best friend, but Henry's friend too, charmed by his dry humor and genuine interest in her marketing insights. "Your first official company party as the CEO's girlfriend? Fiancée," Ruth corrected with a smile, touching the elegant diamond ring on her left finger. The proposal had happened 2 months ago, during a quiet dinner at the same restaurant where they'd had their first public date. Henry had been characteristically thoughtful about it. No public spectacle, just a quiet moment between the two of them where he'd told her that she'd made him remember who he really was, and asked if she'd like to spend the rest of their lives figuring out who they could become together. "Right, fiancé," Destiny grinned. "Even better. You know the whole company is going to be watching you two tonight, right?" "Let them watch," Ruth said, surprised by her own confidence. "We have nothing to hide anymore." The year had brought challenges, certainly. There had been awkward conversations with HR, careful navigation of workplace dynamics, and the occasional whispered speculation about favoritism or special treatment. But there had also been unexpected support from colleagues who were genuinely happy to see both Ruth and Henry thriving, and a growing recognition throughout the company that their relationship had made both of them better at their jobs rather than worse. Ruth had been promoted to senior analyst 4 months ago, an advancement that had come with its own scrutiny until her consistently excellent work made it clear that her relationship with Henry had nothing to do with her professional capabilities. Henry, meanwhile, had become a more approachable and effective leader, his newfound emotional intelligence making him better at everything from client relationships to team management. An hour later, Ruth walked into the grand ballroom at the Fairmont Copley Plaza, the same venue where everything had started 12 months ago. This year's party was even more elaborate, twinkling lights, elegant decorations, and an atmosphere of celebration that felt genuinely joyful rather than simply obligatory. But what struck Ruth most was how different she felt walking into this space. Last year, she'd been curious about the mysterious CEO, intrigued by the puzzle he represented. This year, she was arriving with Henry, her hand in his, both of them relaxed and genuinely happy to be there. "There they are," Trevor called out as Ruth and Henry approached the group from the 31st floor. "Our favorite power couple," Ruth laughed, accepting hugs from Amelia, Bethany, and the other colleagues who had become not just co-workers but genuine friends over the past year. "You two look amazing," Amelia said, taking in Ruth's dress and Henry's perfectly tailored tuxedo. "Very glamorous, very in love, very different from last year," Bethany finished with a grin. "I mean, do you remember what happened at this party last year? I remember someone making a very confident assessment about my emotional resilience," Henry said with a smile, slipping his arm around Ruth's waist, an assessment that turned out to be completely wrong. "Hey," Ruth protested, laughing, "I wasn't wrong about the 2 minutes part. I was wrong about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing." The group laughed, and Ruth marveled at how natural this felt, joking about their origin story with colleagues who had witnessed its beginning, standing with Henry in public without any anxiety about who might see them or what it might mean. "Speaking of which," Trevor said with theatrical seriousness, "I feel like I should take some credit for this whole romance. If I hadn't started that conversation about our unflappable CEO..." "Trevor," Henry said with mock solemnity, "you can absolutely take credit for starting the conversation, but I think Ruth deserves credit for finishing it." Ruth looked up at Henry, remembering that night a year ago when she'd been so confident in her assessment of his character, so certain that he couldn't handle someone who was real and direct, and unimpressed by his carefully constructed persona. She'd been right about one thing: he hadn't been able to handle it. But instead of being overwhelmed, he'd been liberated. The evening progressed beautifully. Ruth and Henry danced together without any of the careful choreography that had marked their early relationship, laughed with colleagues who had become friends, and enjoyed the rare pleasure of being completely themselves in public. It was near the end of the evening when James Whitfield, the board chairman, approached them with a glass of champagne and a warm smile. "Ruth, Henry," he said, "I wanted to congratulate you both on your engagement. The board is absolutely delighted." "Thank you, James," Henry replied. "That means a great deal to us." "You know," James continued, looking between them with obvious satisfaction, When I called Henry last year to express concern about his work-life balance, I never imagined the solution would be quite so elegant. Ruth looked confused. You called him about work-life balance? James nodded, his eyes twinkling. Oh yes. The board had been worried for months that Henry was burning himself out, becoming too isolated. We'd been hoping he'd find some kind of personal fulfillment that might make him a more well-rounded leader. And then, Henry said with a smile, Ruth challenged me to 2 minutes of honest conversation, and everything changed. 2 minutes that turned into a lifetime, Ruth added, looking up at Henry with the kind of open affection that would have terrified her a year ago. As James moved on to mingle with other guests, Ruth and Henry found themselves alone for a moment, near the windows that overlooked Boston's sparkling skyline. Can I tell you something? Henry said quietly, taking her hands in his. Always. A year ago, standing in this same room, I was the most successful and loneliest man in Boston. I had everything I thought I wanted, and nothing that actually mattered. He paused, his blue eyes serious and warm. You didn't just crack my composure, Ruth. You saved my life. Ruth felt tears prick at her eyes. You saved mine too. You helped me remember that being authentic isn't something to apologize for. It's something to celebrate. Henry leaned down to kiss her softly, a gesture that was both intimate and completely natural. Around them, the party continued, but for a moment it felt like they were the only two people in the world. So, Henry said as they broke apart, any regrets about taking on that 2-minute challenge? Ruth laughed, thinking about everything that had led them to this moment. The risks they'd taken, the walls they'd broken down, the courage they'd found to be vulnerable with each other. Just one, she said with a mischievous smile. What's that? I should have asked for 3 minutes. I could have gotten you to fall in love with me even faster. Henry's laughter was rich and genuine and completely unguarded. Ruth Gemmell, he said, you're absolutely right, and I can't wait to spend the rest of my life proving it to you. As they stood there in the same ballroom where their story had begun, surrounded by the same colleagues who had witnessed that first challenge, Ruth realized that sometimes the best love stories weren't about perfect people finding each other. They were about real people finding the courage to be vulnerable, to take risks, and to believe that authenticity was worth more than any carefully constructed facade. And looking at Henry, no longer the untouchable CEO, but simply the man who made her laugh and challenged her thinking, and looked at her like she was his whole world, she knew that her 2-minute assessment had been wrong in the most wonderful way possible. Some love stories don't end. They just begin new chapters. 2 years later, on a crisp Saturday morning in October, Ruth Granville, she still smiled every time she saw her new name, stood in the doorway of Granville & Sons Books, watching her husband arrange a display of new releases with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd once brought to quarterly reports. The morning sun streamed through the large windows, casting warm golden light across the polished wood floors and creating an atmosphere that was both peaceful and alive with possibility. Henry had made the decision 6 months after their wedding, a beautiful ceremony in Eleanor's garden, surrounded by family, friends, and colleagues who had become their chosen family. He'd announced to the board that he was stepping down as CEO to pursue other interests, recommending his successor and ensuring a smooth transition that protected both the company and his reputation. Are you sure about this? Ruth had asked him the night before he'd submitted his resignation letter. They'd been sitting in their apartment. Henry's penthouse had become theirs after the wedding, talking through the implications of such a dramatic career change. I've never been more sure of anything, Henry had replied, taking her hands in his. Ruth, I've spent 15 years building a company and a reputation that impressed everyone, but never made me truly happy. I want to build something that matters, something that feels like who I really am. And so they'd bought the bookstore from Eleanor, who had been ready to retire but reluctant to sell to strangers. Henry had thrown himself into learning the business with the same intensity he'd once brought to corporate acquisitions, while Ruth had negotiated a remote working arrangement with Thornfield that allowed her to maintain her career while helping with the bookstore's marketing and financial management. You're staring, Henry said without looking up from his book display, but Ruth could hear the smile in his voice. I'm appreciating, Ruth corrected, moving into the store and settling behind the register where she'd been helping Eleanor with the morning routine. There's a difference. Henry straightened and turned to face her, and Ruth felt her heart skip the way it still did when he looked at her with that particular combination of love and mild amusement that had become so familiar over the past 2 years. Appreciating what, exactly? Appreciating how happy you look when you're doing something you actually love, Ruth said honestly. You light up differently here than you ever did in a boardroom. It was true. The careful control that had defined Henry's corporate persona had been replaced by something warmer and more natural. He still possessed the same intelligence and analytical mind that had made him successful in business. But now those qualities were directed toward understanding customer preferences, curating book selections, and creating the kind of community space that made people want to linger over coffee and conversation. The door chimed as their first customer of the day entered, Mrs. Chen, a regular who came in every Saturday morning to browse the fiction section and chat about whatever book she'd finished that week. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," Henry called out with genuine warmth. "I set aside that new mystery novel you mentioned last week. It came in yesterday." "Oh, wonderful. You're so thoughtful, Henry." "And Ruth, how are you, dear?" Ruth smiled, marveling at how natural this felt. The easy interaction with regular customers, the sense of being part of a community, the simple pleasure of helping people find books they'd love. It was so different from the high-stakes world of corporate consulting, but it felt real in a way that her previous career sometimes hadn't. As Mrs. Chen browsed and Henry helped her select her next few reads, Ruth found herself thinking about the journey that had brought them here. The woman who had challenged a CEO to 2 minutes of honest conversation had never imagined she'd end up married to that CEO and running a bookstore together. But then again, she'd never imagined that the controlled, intimidating Henry Granville would turn out to be someone who remembered customer preferences and lit up when discussing the economic factors that led to the fall of ancient civilizations with anyone who showed interest. "Penny for your thoughts," Henry said, approaching the register after Mrs. Chen had left with her new books and a promise to return next week. "Just thinking about how far we've come," Ruth replied, reaching out to straighten his collar in a gesture that had become automatic over the years. "Do you ever miss it? The corporate world?" Henry considered the question seriously, the way he always did when she asked him something important. "I miss the intellectual challenge sometimes. I miss the sense of building something significant. But Ruth," he paused, covering her hand with his, "I don't miss being someone I wasn't. I don't miss the loneliness or the pressure to be perfect all the time." "And you think this is better?" Henry looked around the bookstore, at the carefully curated sections, the comfortable reading chairs, the community bulletin board, where local residents posted everything from apartment listings to invitations to book clubs. Then he looked back at Ruth, his blue eyes warm and certain. "Ruth, 3 years ago, I had everything I thought I wanted, and none of what I actually needed. Now I have work that feels meaningful, a wife who challenges me to be better every day, and a life that actually feels like mine." He smiled, the expression completely genuine and unguarded. "Yes, I think this is infinitely better." Ruth felt warmth spread through her chest, the same feeling she'd had on their first real date when Henry had told her she'd helped him remember who he really was. "Even when I tell you that your fiction section organization system is unnecessarily complicated, especially then," Henry laughed, "though I maintain that organizing by historical period within literary movements is both logical and helpful for customers who—" Ruth silenced him with a kiss, soft and sweet and full of the kind of comfortable affection that came from 3 years of learning each other's rhythms and preferences and quirks. "I love you," she said against his lips, the words as natural as breathing after all this time. "I love you too," Henry replied, then pulled back to look at her with an expression that was both tender and mischievous. "Though I should probably mention that I still think you were completely wrong about the 2 minutes thing." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "How so?" "You said I couldn't handle 2 minutes of honest conversation with someone like you. But here we are 3 years later, and I'm still here." Ruth grinned, feeling that familiar spark of playful challenge that had started this whole adventure. "That's because it turns out you're not the man I thought you were." "What kind of man did you think I was?" "I thought you were someone who couldn't handle authenticity. Turns out you were someone who was starving for it." Henry's expression softened, and he reached up to touch her face gently. "And what kind of man am I really?" Ruth looked at him, this man who had surprised her at every turn, who had chosen love over prestige and authenticity over performance, who made her laugh every day and still looked at her like she was the most fascinating person in the world. "You're the kind of man who proves that the best love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other," she said quietly. "They're about real people finding the courage to be vulnerable." As if summoned by their conversation, the door chimed again, and Eleanor entered with her usual Saturday morning energy, carrying coffee for all three of them, and wearing the satisfied expression of a mother who had watched her son find genuine happiness. "Good morning, you two," she said, distributing coffee cups with practiced efficiency. "Busy morning?" "Mrs. Chen came in for her mystery novel," Henry reported, "and Ruth has been questioning my organizational system again." "As she should," Eleanor said with a grin that was clearly directed at Ruth. "Someone has to keep you from turning this place into a library science experiment." Ruth laughed, watching Henry feign offense while his mother continued her gentle teasing. This had become their Saturday morning ritual, Eleanor arriving with coffee, gentle family banter, and the comfortable rhythm of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. "Actually," Eleanor continued, settling into one of the reading chairs with her coffee, "I have some news that might interest you both." "What kind of news?" Ruth asked. Eleanor's expression shifted to something that was equal parts proud and excited. "I got a call yesterday from Boston Magazine. They want to do a feature story about the bookstore, specifically about Henry's transition from corporate CEO to small business owner." Henry looked surprised and slightly uncomfortable. "A magazine story? Eleanor, I don't think—" "Before you say no," Eleanor interrupted, "you should know that they're specifically interested in the story of how finding the right person can help someone find their authentic path in life." Ruth felt her heart skip. "They want to write about us? They want to write about how love can transform not just relationships, but entire life trajectories. About how sometimes the most successful people are the ones who have the courage to redefine success on their own terms." Henry and Ruth exchanged glances, and Ruth could see him weighing the implications. The corporate Henry would have been concerned about public perception, professional reputation, carefully controlled messaging. But this Henry, the man who had learned to prioritize authenticity over image, looked thoughtful rather than anxious. "What do you think?" he asked Ruth. Ruth considered the question, thinking about the journey that had brought them here. "I think our story might help other people realize that it's never too late to choose courage over comfort." Henry's smile was slow and certain. "Then let's tell it." And as they sat there in the bookstore that had become both their livelihood and their legacy, surrounded by books that told countless other love stories, Ruth realized that theirs was still being written. Not in dramatic gestures or corporate boardrooms, but in quiet Saturday mornings and shared coffee, and the daily choice to keep being real with each other. Some love stories, she thought, were worth more than 2 minutes. Some love stories were worth a lifetime. Final message. Thank you for joining Ruth and Henry on their journey from that first challenge at the company party to this quiet morning in their bookstore. Their story reminds us that the best relationships aren't built on perfection, but on the courage to be authentic with someone who sees and loves who we really are. What did this story teach you about the power of authenticity in love? Your participation means a lot to the channel. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.